Hi, everybody. This is Carol Rosardi from Jane Stories Press Foundation. And with me today is Sarah Miner, author of Bright Archive. And Sarah was one of our finalists for the Johnson Award for Women's Literature this year. And we're so happy to have her here with us today to talk about this innovative book. And it's innovative because if you haven't seen the book, you really need to get a copy. And I strongly recommend a physical copy and not an ebook because of the way she marries the graphics with the words to tell the story. And I think it would be very difficult to appreciate what she's doing in an ebook format. So first of all, Sarah, why don't you talk about what inspired you to do this and how you came up with the idea of marrying the words with the graphics, and we can talk about some specifics as you go along.
Carol and Jane Stories Press, thank you so much for having me. And thank you again for listing this book as a finalist. It was such a bright moment in a year that I put this book out. That was a hard year otherwise, hard year for a lot to happen. So I really appreciate it. So the impetus for the book, why I've written it, why I decided to do it in this mode, comes from, I think, the fact that I began my official work in the world as an artist. I thought I was going to be a visual artist, a painter, maybe a designer. That was what I had in mind for my trajectory. And writing kind of stole me away, captured my heart, and I hadn't planned on it. And so when I was pursuing my first MFA, I started writing in these shapes. I started formatting my work in a manner that some of my professors and other peers were sort of like, why do this? And I think I wrote the book to sort of answer that question for myself, like, why do that? And what can it do for the reader to have something going on the page that's visual in a sense that it's shapely, not only about language. And I became really interested in the idea and the concept of an essay collection at that time. And so another part of the project then how do you make an essay collection, right, that has these linked sections that they're like chapters, but they don't proceed sequentially, and an essay collection that also includes many different shapes, right? How do those shapes need to speak to each other in the way that the motifs and themes in the essays also need to? How can each form be fresh, but not additionally overwhelming or challenging? How can one form sort of prepare the audience or teach the reader to anticipate the next one along the way? So those are some of the questions that drove this project, and that I became really interested in, and that I still find myself really fascinated by, especially a book length work that's in sections. That's something I find myself thinking a lot, and I still love to read essay collections for that reason. How do they work on a small level, on the level of each essay? Which one is my favorite? Which one do I think is great at introducing an idea? And then how do they work in total? How do they knit themselves together? Is the last essay the right essay for the end? What's the middle feel like? If it's not a narrative arc, what are we following? What is the writer crafted for us? So those are some of the reasons I think I worked on this. And I should say, most of the essays in this book were started when I was 22. 22 years old. They've changed a lot since then. I revised the book for about 10 years before it was picked up, and I was sending it out that whole time as well. So it's been a book that's lived with me, for about a decade, and has changed a lot along the way. So
okay, so I'd like to talk about the cover.
Yes.
I didn't mention to you. I mean, the cover is a blue illustration of a rabbit with bright red eyes and looks like red whiskers, and almost like he's a carnivore, but bunnies are herbivores. So there's got to be a story behind this cover.
Well, the story is really the story of all the cover conversations I had with Rescue Press. I think I know different authors have had various experiences with like, how do you choose a cover? How much say do you have in what your cover is? How many options do they present you? And if you say no, did they present you another round of options? And for me, the cover was really important for a book like this because, you know, it's so visual. I think a lot about visuality. So we had quite a few different options for the cover. You know, one was, I think it was an old illustration from a fairy tale where a woman was at the top of the tree and all these wolves were like barking at the bottom, like had chased her up the tree. And we also had one that was like really a lot more plain, a lot just the title, and then like kind of a weird creature sitting on a branch above it. And so I think as we looked at images and as we thought about the book as a whole, which was really not something I'd had the chance to do, you know, what is it going to be like when it's a physical object? We kept moving towards more minimalist covers because there's so much to see and experience once you get inside that it might be overkill to do something like very detailed on the front. And the bunny, you know, I've since called it like the cold rabbit or like the lucky bunny, but I like that it's a little scary, you know, like the red-eyed bunny, like it's a little bit like maybe suggests something else is going on. And I think of it as the rabbit that shows up in the central essay, which is the log cabin quilt. There's a rabbit mentioned early on there that's like screaming. It's being eaten while I'm camping in the woods with a friend. And it's also sort of a symbol for me there of something I experienced growing up in this landscape and somehow had an understanding of that my friend didn't, because this same patch of land had been owned by my family long before that, even though it wasn't owned by my family by the time I was camping on it. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something in the book that's about that layering and kind of being able to look back and unpack what that means to kind of have knowledge of a place that's maybe not linear or not written down necessarily. So those are some of the reasons for the rabbit. Yeah. And I like the rabbit too, because eventually I animated the book cover, and there's an animation you can see where the text spins around the rabbit in a circle, and those simple elements really helped that be possible.
Well, you mentioned the log cabin quilt, and one of Sarah's chapters is written as a log cabin square. And when I was looking over the book in preparation for our interview, I noticed the penultimate word in this chapter is bright, which talks about bright home. And I thought, oh, now the literature teacher in me is coming out. Oh, bright home, bright archive. There's a connection here. And I wanted to know if this was something intentional that you did, and that's how you brought one of the hints that you were giving to the reader to pull this together.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is a moment that's supposed to ring one of those bells for the reader, right? Like if one version of bright is like a burning house that you're circling back to, that's what these horses are doing in this scene, then maybe what are the other versions of bright that the book is interested in or is interested in thinking about. And we also went through more titles than covers for the book. So I originally had two very long titles that I thought the book had for a long time when I was sending it out, and that I'd thought of as the name of the project for a while. And I think Bright Archive came at the encouragement of the editor, Carol Pagel, who's really a genius and was very right in pushing us towards a title that was a little more minimalist, you know, sort of in the way the cover conversation went. And for me, Bright Archive was one that I suggested. I had sent her a whole list of like 2-word titles, and she eventually was like, okay, yeah, this one. And that, I mean, for me is about Bright Archive, right? So the history of these places and things are often histories that are, when I approach them, have been kind of concealed or covered up or been told in a manner that that doesn't really get to maybe what's most interesting about those histories. And so Bright Archive, one way I think about the title is like a flashlight being shined on the archive that's usually dark, like illuminating some of those corners and shadows. Or like the brightness of the archive, right? Like the things that are so, like really special and shining and gem-like in there that we might think of as like dusty and old and irrelevant, unimportant to us. So
But it's very poetic in that, the word choice is so deliberate and specific and meaningful on so many levels.
yes, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
And I found the whole book that way. And I don't mean this as anything negative. I found the book challenging. It was challenging to the reader. It wasn't, mind candy. It was, reading it and connecting with how do the different graphic shapes help tell the story, and where is Sarah trying to take me? And I have a few notes on some of them, like the first chapter, The New Age Below Ground, where, and again, I apologize to viewers who haven't seen the book, but part of it is written right side up. And then when you turn it upside down, it's another part of the story. And it's like, wow, isn't that true about just about every situation in life?
Yes. Yeah. So it is a book that I think is challenging to folks who are used to reading, left to right and flipping the page and moving through a text at the pace that they're used to, at the pace that we've been taught to move since probably most of us were learning to read chapter books at some age. And this book, I think, is interested in a kind of slowing down of the reader that I hope is something that the reader agrees is pleasurable eventually, comes to understand is part of an invitation that feels sort of collaborative, that is asking the reader to have as much say in how these pieces mean as they do. And so sometimes I've talked about some of the forums as a rumble strip, like, oh, wait, hold on, slow, 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 like on the highway. I thought about them. And then, also I thought it was a really interesting conversation to have with the editorial team about which essay should open this book. And actually, I find it so fascinating now that the essay that opens the book is the only essay that asks you to turn the whole book around, so maybe one of the hopes I have is that after doing that, the other texts seem pretty easy, like you've already flipped the book around as you're reading it and maybe gotten confused at some point, like which is up and which is down, which is maybe one of the conceits of that essay as well. So that's an idea I encountered really early on in writing, which is like, if a text is challenging in some way, how is it teaching the reader to read it through that challenging mechanism? And I think that's maybe true for the beginning of this essay. It teaches you that there's some conceptual reward to the flipping back and forth, like you get secrets when you flip, and also it makes you think about like the inverse of the truth of a place. But then also this essay itself is trying to teach the reader, like there is a conceptual weight to the visual gymnastics you'll do along the way, and you're being invited to think about that, to consider, oh, how do I make sense of this? What does it mean for me to do this in my space? So that's how I think about that first essay.
A couple of the ones that I guess really spoke to me in ways I can't quite articulate was, I really liked Into the Lineman, because I learned some vocabulary. I never really knew these words, but the lineman is the space under the leaves, right? That's in the soffit area, and the space that we consider to be dead space. But you invite us into that space. And again, the graphics in the book, and I apologize, I know people can't see this very well, but the graphics in the book invite you into that space. You're very candid about a story about the critter getter that introduces you to the space when you have an uninvited guest that meets possibly his demise in that space. And how you learn about this space and you teach us about it. And even that space, it can be a dead space or it can be a space of promise. And
Yeah.
I found that dualism amazing. I mean, it's the challenge of not just challenging, it's challenging your way of thinking that there's another way to look at something. It's liminal or it's emergent. And especially in the times we live in, to encourage people to look at things another way.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely something I'm thinking about during this essay. And it's there's a diagram early on in the piece that kind of dictates what the structure of the pages will be when you're actually reading the prose later on. And I think it's interesting to maybe know, like, for me as a writer, and then for the person reading, they learn that I didn't know the word soffit before going on this tour of my grandparents' house with an unusual exterminator, and he taught me that word. So there's kind of a loop happening where you've been reading in this soffit format for quite a few pages before you learn how I knew about it. And so this also means that when I was writing this piece, that I was thinking a lot about the place and the text before the format really emerged to the surface for me, before I found a name for the way I was thinking about these parts in relation. And I do think, I love that in your notes for this question, you say, emergent property, wait, did you say about this? Liminal space as also emergent property, depending on point of view, glass half empty situation. Yes, definitely. And for me, for those who haven't read it, I'm going through this over 100-year-old home with an exterminator. And this home is one that a family used to live in for a long, long time before my grandparents bought the house. And the house sat empty for about 10 years before they moved in. And when they moved in, essentially all of the family's personal objects were still in the house. And they held on to some of them. They didn't have a lot of furniture when they first moved in. They were very young. And so when I grew up visiting that house a lot, spending a lot of time, especially during my parents' divorce, I sat in those chairs, I looked at the books. And so it felt like there was kind of a two-layer existence happening there, a haunting, but a nice haunting. And I become interested in the essay about how your ancestors or your family can be a group of people who maybe aren't blood related to you, but are embedded in a home that becomes very important to your family too. And you kind of share it.
I like the way that the house was, you talk about the house like it's an organic being, like it's living, and that history that's in there is living too. And one of the other things that I have to get the right chapter here, the name of the chapter. Oh, foul shoots on the archive downriver. I mean, you take us from the mouth of the Mississippi down to the Delta.
Yes, yeah.
With the river being represented by a space on the page. You do a much better job of showing the book on the camera than I do.
Well, I've got my clouds that take it out.
Yeah, you got it there better. And you identify the states that you're going through. And it's just moving in more ways than one, the way it just takes you through on this journey.
Yeah, and I think, that's another way this, in terms of what an essay collection is, I found it really interesting to try to address a place that was really meaningful for me, but was hard for me to articulate from a lot of angles. So actually, I've never had this thought before, but when we're looking at those two essays together, I think okay, the soffit is maybe the most micro version of the landscape, of the landscape of the home, but also the landscape of Iowa and the Mississippi, which is just a few 100 yards from that house. And then this is the bird's eye view of that landscape, and thinking about all the implications of what it means to live there, along with many other people throughout history, and how the landscape you think you live on is actually connected to so many others inherently. We think we live upon the Mississippi, and my friend Lizzie from New Orleans also thinks she lives upon the Mississippi, and she asked me once, like, oh, at the top, is it just a creek? Is it just a small trickle? And I was like, no, it's a river all the way down. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And again, it's a whole point, the whole idea of perspective.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
And
Definitely.
the connections. One of the many things that I also enjoyed about the book are the connections that you draw. Not only, like your present living in the house with the past of the house, but
Mhm.
also with the handling the beast, with talking about the ancient cave
Mhm.
drawings in southern France with
Yeah.
contemporary life. And just this almost seemed to be like a leitmotif all the way through the book,
Mhm.
that you're making connections between things that we normally don't make connections with.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's like some of the greatest fun for me of writing in a way that includes both like deeply personal information and also research that I come upon or am interested in relationship to those experiences. Because I think in nonfiction, the nonfiction I love to read is often very much about someone's life and self, but they're using materials that are far outside their own experience to kind of speak to and reveal that. And I think that was something I was also trying to do in the Handling the Beast essay, which was like, how do you say what you mean? How do you say what you feel? And strangely, all of this information about hands, about historic caves, about art, and the image of the bull actually were starting to be able to speak to what I was trying to express in those
Yeah.
pages.
And I can imagine, I used to do typesetting.
Mm.
I'm glad I didn't typeset the chapter with
Oh
the
my
actual
gosh, I know.
knots in there.
Yes, yeah.
And when I went back and looked at it earlier this week, I thought, it's naughty. And this is the
Mhm.
only chapter that really talks at all about sex or sexuality. And I thought, she's making a point, making a connection.
Yes, yeah, that's funny. Yeah, I agree. Yes. Yeah, so C.V. Perez is the designer for Rescue Press, and he is absolutely a gem. He taught me a lot about book design as we went back and forth in conversation about how these essays would live together in a bound format, because some of them had been published before, but they would have been, in the size of a magazine that could fit more text per page, or they were printed on 8.5 by 11 sheets, which was also much different. And so yes, I learned a lot about page design, and especially these knots. The knot text is, so those are images made with text that I designed in an InDesign program. So they weren't as hard as it seems. We don't. Luckily, this book wasn't typeset by hand. I mean, it could have been. I suppose that would have been another art project, but those design programs made it a little easier to get those knots on the page. And in this piece, I am, where I'm thinking about sexual assault. I'm thinking about fairy tales. I'm thinking about what it means to kind of inherit, again, like these stories about people, and what it means that they reiterate like a virus in many cultures and books and tales for children across time. And so the knot similarly is an image that's reiterating but changing each time. And I hope that in the way that formal poetry thinks about how meaning can be communicated with shape or space, each shape of the knot is also asking the reader to think about and engage with the bit of text that it contains in a different way. It can almost communicate a type of sound, or slow down and speed up the reading at different points in the sentence. So that became super fun for me. For a while I was really into the concrete poets who do this. They make illustrations with text, and this book is interested in that and also interested in pushing beyond that. And in the knots, that's probably the most literal communication with concrete poets that there is in the book.
Okay. I apologize if I'm looking for symbolism where it's accidental, but Your last chapter being Signal, Arizona. I Googled to see if Signal, Arizona was a real town because I thought, is she using signal as an imperative verb, like
Mhm.
signal something? Or is she using signal as a noun, like I'm giving you a signal? And I found out that Signal was a ghost town. And a lot of your story takes place in Muscatine, Iowa, which, and you talk about how buttons used to be a big industry there. And of course, so much of that is now outsourced to the
Right.
Far East with cheaper labor.
Mhm.
And so in its way, Muscatine is a ghost town,
Mhm.
not quite as ghostly as Signal,
Right,
but,
yeah. Yeah.
but there was, there's so much meaning in everything there.
Mhm.
But it's the last two sentences in that last chapter
Yeah.
where you say, I prefer that from now on, we only converse in shapes. Please place the shape of your idea here. Have people sent you their shapes? Have you received shapes from people?
No, this should be an official call. I would love to see your shapes. If anyone has one that they've drawn on the page, which is what I'm definitely inviting there. And I think for me, like I'm again thinking about like, how do you end a book like this? You know, it's not this the story is over. It's not that everything seems summed up and connected by the end. And so a really short piece like this felt like a good moment to end upon because it's really communicating what I think the ethos of this book is, or sort of the inner mind, which is like the reader present on the page is about half of what the book is doing. You know, for this book to function, it needs a reader who's willing to look for and acknowledge those different motifs along the way and think like, oh, what is signaled? You know, like Carol, you're the ideal reader. It sounds like
Oh,
one.
thank you.
And so that's literal, like, please place the shape of your idea here. Yes, please draw something and be involved in the book as much as you were when you took a whole piece out of it and you read the log cabin. But also, please place the shape of your idea here, I think is a way for me to say, that's what I was hoping you were doing across the entire book as well. You know, conceptually, the shape of your idea is present in the shapes of these texts.
And it's a profound question too, because I kept thinking about it. Like, okay, what is the shape of my major idea? And I kept coming back to a question mark. You know, why me? Why was I, I shared with you before, I grew up in a coal mining town. Why was I so lucky to get out? Why have I had these wonderful opportunities in my life? Why was I born here and not in Herat, Afghanistan, where I'm sure I would be dead by now? You know, like what, why? And I think that would be my shape. But it would be great if people did send you shapes. Perhaps in the comments on the YouTube channel, we can get people to.
Please have them do it. That's such a great idea. And I love what you're saying too, Carol, because I think, you know, I also teach essay writing to college students, and a lot of what I'm often trying to get those students to think is what you're saying, which is like, instead of starting a piece with a plan, with, oh, this is a story I want to tell, this is the thing I hope it will mean, this is the motif I'm going to wind throughout, like the best way I think essays are started and continue are with a question, right? How can you write with a question, and the writing becomes a way to clarify that question or restate the question in as many ways as possible throughout the piece. And if at the end, what you've done is just clarify what you're asking or discovered to yourself something else about what you're asking, then it's over. That's the end. It doesn't have to have an answer necessarily. And I think that's the way a lot of these pieces are also moving individually.
Well, I think we've sort of, in a way, bastardized the meaning of essay, because the word comes from the French, which means to try, SIA. So to try to understand, to try to find an answer.
Yes.
And in our typical American, we want it now way, all essays are supposed to have a point and get it across in 500 words, or preferably 250, and
Yep.
let's do it.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and and with the pleasure of then reading essays is just seeing another person trying to work something out on the page. The working of the mind on the page is what Andrew Munson calls it. And I really am drawn again and again to reading essays because that's what it feels like for me to live, and it's really tough for someone to elucidate that entirely on a page, to kind of slow themselves down enough to explain what it feels like to think in that way, to try to ask over and over. And so, yeah, I think you're right that that's something that they're doing.
Yeah. You mentioned your publisher, Rescue Press, a few times, and I did want to ask you, you said you were sending it out for 10 years because your book is different. Okay. It's, again, the marriage of the graphics are telling and the illustrations are telling the story as much as the words. It's not that the graphics illustrate the story. The graphics are an integral part of the story. How difficult was it to find a publisher that shared your vision and that allowed, that mutual experimentation on the page?
Yes. Well, it was challenging. And I think that a lot of our presses in the US especially they're precariously funded. Like we have so many excellent university presses and small indie presses, but really the presses that are most funded are sort of the big five, New York. Yeah. And I think that means that not a lot of folks have big design budgets. And so if they see a book like this, they're sort of like, I don't even know how we would be able to afford that. It comes down to the funding in a lot of ways. And so, I saw this more when I was submitting individual essays to literary journals, but I would get often folks saying, we really like this writing, we'd love to publish it in a plain text format without the shape of the text. And I did actually do that when I was younger for a couple pieces. I was sort of like, okay, I'd really like this to be published, so go ahead, take out the form. But I ended up regretting it when I would see, a couple years later, that piece in the journal. I'd be like, no, like, why did I do that? I could have just waited and found someone to do it in the way that I had intended. Because, at least half of what the piece was doing, at least half of the work I had put into it was gone in those versions. So I actually did get an offer from another press to publish the book a couple years earlier. But they wanted to change all of those forms and really reduce what they were doing. And I really thought about it for a while, because it had been a long time with this book. I was ready to work on another project.
Of course.
And luckily Rescue Press was interested in it and was interested in doing the forms as they stand. They certainly changed through my conversations with the editors, in many ways, and then in all ways for the better. They changed, but they approached it with kind of a pitch that was like, hey, we know you have another offer. We want to do this right. We're interested in the way that text and visuality are combined here. And I was sold. I was like, yes.
Great.
Let's do it.
Well, speaking of the visuality, you shared with me your visual. We go, trying to share it with the screen here. Okay. And do you want to talk a little bit about this as it goes by?
Sure. These are all images. So I'm a writer, and also I've been, I mentioned that I started as a visual artist, and I've carried that practice through my writing as well. And so these are all images of gallery installations that I've built of different texts in this book. So there you can see the log cabin quilt, very large on a wheel. It spins. So the reader spins it, and then the next image is of me performing the log cabin quilt square in a digital space. So I became really interested in how not only how the role of space on the page, shapely text could affect how the reader engaged and what they took away from reading, but also how if you changed that physical component, the visuality of it, what else changes about the reading experience. So almost every one of these essays has three versions. One is the version that you would have seen in a literary magazine. So, probably a taller, slimmer version. And so the text necessarily had to be reformatted for that. Two, it lived in a gallery. Here you can see into the lemon on the light table there on a piece of blue paper that you read in a different manner. And there are a bunch of artifacts around it from the house. So you sort of have the tangibility of the space alongside it. And then the last version is in the book, because it was interesting for me as someone who had wanted a book for so long. I really wanted my own book, the object of it, a physical book that had all of my writing in it. It was interesting to then discover that everything I'd been writing and making resisted that format. It was too wide. I had forgotten entirely the role of the gutter. I had forgotten margins. I'd forgotten what it was like to flip the page and how that would change the way that someone saw what was depicted on it. And so the essays had to necessarily change to fit that format as well. And the text did shift slightly in each version. I had to revise for the format that presented itself, which was, that's the joke I have with myself as both a writer and a visual artist is the reason I do this, the reason I make it so tough, the reason I put these texts in different formats is that it's a great way to revise. It's a great way to force yourself to revise. If you want to put an essay in a scroll that hangs perpendicularly from the ceiling in a spiral, you're probably going to have to cut some things, and those things probably needed to be cut. You probably knew which things didn't need to be in the piece, and so those forced me to make some of those decisions. And so the writing and the making has always been integral to my process.
Before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you if there's anything you wanted to say about any of the pieces that we didn't get a chance to talk about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think the one thing I like to say is that there's no wrong way to read this book. I think sometimes readers are also very good students, and they're like, oh, am I doing this right? Did I get this? Am I understanding this right? And I think I want to emphasize that the answer is really a collaborative answer. This book is inviting every different reader to come and make each essay mean something slightly differently. And that is really thrilling to me as an author. That's something I love about it. So I love to hear from people about how they read something or what connections they made from their life as they were reading. Folks often like to tell me if they read the Fallowshoots essay back and forth on each page, or all down one side, all down the other side. I love to learn about that. And so I'm always happy to be in conversation. And there's no wrong way. Anything you're doing, any inventiveness you're having as you read is part of what I'm excited about too.
Well, it was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I think I already mentioned which some of my favorite pieces were, but every piece invited the reader, invited me to think a little bit more. It definitely was not, when I was reading the book, I had the sense that I was reading something special.
Thank you.
This was a special book. And so thank you very much. And thank you so much for being so forthcoming with your thoughts. I had shared with you before, I remember when someone asked William Faulkner what something meant. His response was, well, just read it again.
Oh my gosh, I know.
And you have just been so forthcoming with explaining things and saying, yeah, I did kind of mean that, or yeah. So I really appreciate that. That was great to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much as well. It's been really a delight.
And best wishes for the rest of the year and whatever holidays you celebrate.
Yes, same to you. Happy
Okay.
end of year.